The wind howled across the open plains of Montana, lifting dust and sorrow in equal measure. The cabin stood small and worn, leaning like an old man tired of surviving. Its wooden boards bore the memory of winters too long and storms too bitter. Inside, Claire Whitmore clutched her shawl tighter around her thin shoulders. Her fingers were red from chopping kindling, and her once rosy cheeks had faded into a dull pale. The fire in the hearth crackled faintly, struggling like everything else in her life. Three children huddled on the patchwork rug. Eli, 10, always looking to be strong; Sarah, 8, quiet and observant; and Lily, barely 5, who still believed that their father might come back from the hills one day. But he wouldn't, not ever again. Claire had buried James Whitmore beneath the rocky hill 2 winters ago after pneumonia claimed him in 3 days flat. Since then, she had done everything she could, mending clothes for neighbors, trading eggs for flour, and praying harder than she ever had. But the land had dried, the well had soured, and the townsfolk had grown colder. "There's no place for a woman with mouths to feed and no man to her name," one had said just last week. And now, the final blow, the last of the flour was gone. The chickens hadn't laid in days, and this morning, when she'd gone to fetch water, she found the well had caved in completely. They had nothing. Claire didn't cry. She hadn't allowed herself that in a long while. But when she tucked the children into bed that night, she lingered a moment longer, brushing a curl from Lily's forehead and whispering, "I'm still here, baby. I'll find a way." Far off, beyond the horizon, someone watched. A figure on horseback. Wrapped in a tattered buffalo hide and painted in the dusk's shadow, the man sat unmoving on a ridge, his eyes fixed on the little cabin below. A wide-brimmed hat shielded most of his face, but his gaze burned with quiet fire. He had been following stories, whispers of injustice, cruelty, abandonment, not for glory, not for reward, but because he had once been abandoned too. His name was unknown. The towns called him Ghost, but long ago he had answered to a real name, and now he had seen enough. He turned his horse down the ridge toward the Whitmore cabin, the cold wind at his back and a promise in his heart. A promise to protect. Claire was pulling her threadbare coat tighter against the morning chill when the knock came. It wasn't loud, just 2 firm raps, measured and steady. Still, it startled her more than a thunderclap might have. No one came this far out unless they wanted something. Or worse, planned to take something. She reached instinctively for the old rifle James had left above the mantel. It hadn't been fired in over a year, and she wasn't even sure if the bullets she had were any good. Still, she held it like it meant something. Another knock. "Who's there?" she called, trying to keep the tremble from her voice. Eli peeked around the corner from the loft, holding Sarah's hand behind him. "It's all right, Mama," he whispered. "I'll get the axe." "No," Claire said firmly. "Stay upstairs with your sisters." She stepped to the door and opened it just enough to peer through the crack, and froze. A tall figure stood under the awning, wrapped in thick hide and dusted with snow. His skin was sun-darkened, his hair long, tied behind his back in a low braid. His face bore deep lines, not just from time but from pain. Scars marked his jaw and one side of his neck. His eyes, dark as burnt cedar, met hers without threat, but with something even more disarming. Understanding. "Who are you?" Claire asked, tightening her grip on the rifle. The man didn't move. "Not here to harm you. You have children. No food, no water. I came to help." Her breath caught in her throat. "How do you know that?" "I watched," he answered. "2 nights now. That's not exactly comforting." His mouth twitched, almost a smile, but not quite. "I know, but I stayed back. Because I know fear. And I didn't want to bring more." Claire stood frozen, torn between instinct and something else. Something unfamiliar, but warm. This man spoke plainly, without the oily charm of drifters or the pity of townsfolk. He seemed real. "I don't have anything to pay you with," she said finally. "I'm not here for pay." "What do you want?" He paused. Then, with quiet clarity, "To make sure you don't die." The stranger introduced himself simply as Rye. He didn't say where he came from, didn't explain the meaning of the wolf pendant around his neck or the faded tattoo on his shoulder. He just rolled up his sleeves and got to work. By noon, he had built a new brace for the collapsed well and pulled clean water from its depths. By sundown, he had mended the chicken coop, reinforced the front door, and silently fixed the leaking chimney. He shared dried venison from his pack and showed Eli how to set a simple snare. The children warmed to him quicker than Claire expected. Lily called him the quiet giant. Sarah asked if he was an angel, and Eli watched him like a boy watches a man he wished he could be. Claire stayed cautious, until she saw Rye wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat and whispering in a language she didn't understand. He didn't know she was watching, but the pain on his face told her that whatever haunted him, it was deep, maybe deeper than her own grief. The next morning, Claire made biscuits, thin and dry but warm. She handed one to Rye across the table. He looked surprised. "You didn't have to," he said. "Yes, I did," she replied softly. For the first time since James died, she meant it. 3 days had passed since Rye arrived, and with each one, the cabin felt a little less like a tomb. Claire found herself breathing easier, sleeping longer, even laughing, something she hadn't done in months. She didn't trust it fully, not yet, but the weight on her chest had started to shift. Maybe not gone, but lighter. Still, trouble doesn't vanish just because a man swings an axe with quiet strength or tucks in a child who isn't his. Trouble waits, sometimes in plain sight. It started with the horses. Eli ran in one afternoon, face pale. "Mama, the gray's gone." Claire set down her sewing. "Gone?" "The rope's been cut, not chewed," he said. "And there are boot prints, big ones, heading back toward the hills." Rye was already outside, examining the ground. He crouched low, his fingers brushing the soil like it spoke to him. When he rose, his jaw was tight. "3 men, one with a limp. They took more than your horse," he said quietly. "They took your peace." Claire swallowed. "Who would do this?" His eyes were hard now. "Men who think you're easy to hurt." That night, Rye stayed awake by the fire, sharpening his blade with slow, precise strokes. The metal hissed softly in rhythm with the wind. Claire watched him from the doorway of the bedroom, arms folded against her chest. "Are you always like this?" she asked. "Looking for danger?" He didn't look up. "I don't look. It usually finds me." A silence fell between them, not uncomfortable, but thick with things unsaid. She stepped closer. "Why are you really here, Rye?" He finally met her eyes. "Because I once stood where you are. Hungry, afraid, alone. Only I didn't have children to fight for, just myself." "And someone helped you?" His gaze flickered to the fire. "No, no one came." Claire's breath caught in her throat. "And that's why you're here now," she whispered. He nodded once. At dawn, Rye left without a word, taking Eli with him. Claire nearly stopped them, but Rye had asked the night before, and something about the request, gentle but firm, told her it was important. They returned at noon with a rabbit, a basket of wild onions, and a look in Eli's eyes that hadn't been there before. A kind of pride. "He let me track it myself," Eli said, "and he called me Little Wolf." Claire raised a brow at Rye. "Little Wolf?" Rye shrugged, but a flicker of amusement danced in his eyes. "He earned it." That night, as Claire ladled stew into bowls, she watched her son sit straighter, shoulders back, confidence blooming. Sarah helped Lily braid her hair, and for the first time, the sound of children giggling filled the room. It was fragile, but it was real, and it was about to be tested. From the edge of the cottonwoods, 3 men watched the light in the cabin. One spit tobacco on the frozen ground. "She's got someone with her now." "Don't matter," another said. "Ain't no law out here. Widow or not, that land was promised. We'll take it back, and teach her what happens when you don't know your place." The third man, face scarred and eyes cold, smiled. "Let her think she's safe." He tapped his rifle once against his boot. "Then we'll burn it down." The sky was streaked in violet and gold when Claire stepped out with a pail in hand. The prairie was quiet, too quiet. The kind of quiet that settles right before a storm or after a mistake too big to fix. Rye stood near the barn, scanning the hills beyond the cottonwoods. His posture was calm, but Claire could feel the tension humming through him like a pulled bowstring. "You sense something," she said. He didn't answer right away. His hand brushed the worn handle of the knife at his belt. "I don't trust silence," he murmured. "Not out here." Claire followed his gaze. The trees were still, their shadows long in the sinking light, but the feeling in her chest tightened like laced boots. She stepped closer. "Is someone coming?" "Yes." That night, Rye didn't sleep. He moved from the barn to the tree line, setting traps and marking spots with small stones, things only someone trained to track would notice. Claire stayed inside, holding Lily and Sarah close, while Eli refused to leave the porch. "Mama, I can help," he said. "He showed me things." "I know, sweetheart, and I'm proud of you." She knelt and looked him in the eye. "But I need you safe. Just this once. Stay by me." The boy's jaw trembled, but he nodded. From the corner of the room, Rye spoke low. "The boy's got heart, but heart needs timing." Claire turned. "And when is the right time?" Rye's eyes met hers, steady and calm. "When we're still breathing come morning." The attack came not at midnight, but just before it, when the last of the light had drained from the fire and the world was hushed in that eerie hour between days. The first sound was the snap of a tripwire outside the chicken coop. The second was a shout. "Now!" one voice bellowed. "He's alone!" 3 men burst from the brush, one limping, another carrying a torch, and the third with a rifle cocked. They weren't expecting what came next. Rye moved like wind over water, silent, swift, exact. He stepped from the shadows and struck the man with the torch, knocking him to the ground before he could hurl it. Flames licked the grass nearby, but Rye stomped them out with the heel of his boot. The limping man lunged toward the cabin door. Eli screamed. Before the man could reach the steps, a snare tightened around his ankle and yanked him backward with a thud. He howled, writhing, but couldn't break free. The man with the rifle fired once, missed, and raised the barrel again. But Claire had already stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand, heart in her throat. "I've got my children in here," she said, voice shaking but firm. "You're not taking another thing from me." The man hesitated, then smiled. "You don't got the guts, woman." Click. He looked down. Rye had appeared behind him, knife pressed to his side. "She doesn't need guts," Rye said quietly. "She has me." The rifle dropped. By dawn, the three attackers were gone, tied to their horses, beaten but alive, and pointed back toward the town that had sent them. Rye had said just 5 words. "Don't come back. Not ever." And they hadn't looked back once. Claire poured coffee into a tin cup with trembling hands. The sun was rising, turning the frost on the window golden. "You saved us," she said. Rye shook his head. "You saved yourselves. I just stood where I was needed." She handed him the cup. "Then maybe stay a while longer?" He didn't answer right away, just looked toward the hills. "There's always someone to protect," he said. "But maybe this time, I don't have to ride just yet." And for the first time, Claire didn't feel like a widow. She felt like someone beginning again. The days that followed brought an unfamiliar calm to the little homestead. For the first time in years, Claire didn't wake with panic pressing against her chest. The children played outside again. Lily made flower chains. Sarah drew pictures with coal on flat stones, and Eli followed Rye everywhere, asking questions, soaking up every lesson like the prairie soil did after the first rain. Rye never said much, but what he taught through action stuck more deeply than words ever could. How to track wind direction by watching the grass. How to listen for what wasn't there, not just what was. How to light a fire in wet weather or silence your steps near prey. Claire watched them from the cabin window, her hands in the dough, her heart learning how to be still again. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch watching the clouds roll in from the west, Claire turned to Rye. "Where did you learn all this?" He didn't look away from the sky. "Here and there. From people who didn't mean to teach me, and a few who did." She hesitated. "You were raised by your people?" "My mother was Lakota," he said softly. "My father, a white soldier. He left before I was old enough to remember. I grew up between two worlds that didn't much care for each other." Claire glanced down. "That's a hard line to walk." Rye nodded. "It is. But I learned to live in the space between, to listen more than I speak, to move when others freeze, to disappear if I had to." She turned to face him fully. "And now?" His eyes met hers, steady. "Now I'm learning something harder." "What's that?" "To stay." That evening, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and distant pine. Claire lit a lantern in the window, not because she needed the light, but because it felt like a way of saying, "We're still here." The family sat around the small table for supper, venison stew with wild onions and cornbread made from the last of their trade flour. It wasn't much, but it tasted like something stronger than survival. It tasted like home. Later that night, after the children were tucked in and the fire burned low, Claire stood on the porch wrapped in a shawl, watching the stars prick through the clouds. Rye stood beside her in silence, arms crossed, gaze fixed on the horizon. "They're not coming back, are they?" she asked. "No," he said. "Men like that don't return unless they've forgotten the lesson." "And if they forget?" He didn't turn. "Then I remind them." Claire smiled faintly. "You always carry the weight of the world?" He looked at her then. Not just glanced, looked, like he was really seeing her. "Not always. Sometimes," he said, voice low. "I'd rather carry someone else's burden for a while." Her breath caught in her throat. There were no grand declarations, no promises. Just two souls, battered and quiet, standing side by side in the stillness of the prairie. And for the first time, neither of them felt alone. The peace they'd found on the prairie didn't go unnoticed for long. One crisp morning, as Claire was washing linens in the stream near the cabin, a rider approached from the south. The dust trail caught Rye's eye before the figure came into focus. He stood still, alert, but not tense. He let the rider come close before stepping into view. The man reined in his horse, removed his hat, and nodded politely. "Name's Deputy Harlan, from Willow Ridge." Claire joined them, wiping her hands on her apron. "Something wrong?" "No, ma'am," Harlan said, casting a curious glance toward Rye. "Just came to check on you. Town's been talking since them men turned up bruised and bound, claiming they were run off your property." Claire stiffened, but Rye didn't move. "They tried to burn my home," she said calmly. "Threatened my children. Rye stopped them." Harlan raised his brows. "Did he now?" "Yes," Claire said, firmer now. "And if the law had done its job, maybe I wouldn't have needed a stranger to protect what little we have left." Harlan nodded slowly. "Fair enough." He dismounted and looked around the property, at the repaired fence line, the smoke from the chimney, the footprints of children dancing in the mud. "You've made something here," he said. People in town may not see it, but I do. And I've got no quarrel with a man who protects what others try to ruin. Rye nodded once. Then we understand each other. I reckon we do. Before he left, Harlan turned in his saddle. One more thing. There's word the land agent in town's been planning to reclaim plots that aren't being used proper. Yours might be next on the list. Claire's stomach dropped. We've lived here for years. I know. And you've got every right to stay, Harlan said. But he's been buying signatures from men who don't own what they're selling. If I were you, I'd find someone who can help you make that claim legal before it's taken out from under you. With that, the deputy tipped his hat and rode off. That night, Claire sat at the table, a map spread out before her. Rye studied it silently beside her, his brow furrowed. There must be records, she murmured. James bought this land before Eli was born, but if that paper's gone... They'll use it against you, Rye said. Claire looked up at him. Then what do? We get ahead of them. How? He traced the trail from the cabin to Willow Ridge with his finger. There's an elder Lakota man who lives east of here. Used to ride with land scouts. He knows every hand who worked for the agent and every lie told. You know him? I owe him. Claire hesitated. Is it safe to go alone? Rye didn't answer immediately. Then, with a rare softness in his voice, he said, Come with me. The next morning, Sarah and Lily stayed behind with a neighboring farm wife who owed Claire a favor. Eli begged to ride along. Please, Mama, I can help. She looked at Rye. He'll ride quiet, Rye said. And that was that. Claire mounted her horse for the first time in months, adjusting her bonnet against the wind. Eli rode proudly beside her. Rye led the way. They traveled east under an open sky, following barely marked trails, passing broken fences and abandoned homesteads. The journey wasn't easy, but with each mile, Claire remembered who she had once been, before widowhood, before fear. She was still that woman, and beside her rode a man who had never promised her anything, yet gave her everything, safety, strength, and silence that understood her pain better than words ever could. They reached the edge of a narrow valley by dusk, where cottonwoods lined a slow-moving creek and the sky flushed red with the last breath of sunlight. A small cabin stood half hidden in the brush, smoke rising from a crooked chimney. Rye reined in his horse. We walk from here. Claire dismounted, helping Eli down gently. Why? He's not fond of surprises. As they approached, a figure emerged from the cabin. A tall, broad-shouldered man with gray braids and a weathered face carved by sun and age. His eyes were sharp as flint, and though his body moved slowly, Claire sensed he missed nothing. He leaned on a staff carved with markings Claire didn't recognize. You bring the wind, Rye, the old man said in a gravelly voice. And you still watch the trees like they talk to you, Hawk, Rye replied. The man smiled just slightly. Sometimes they do. Hawk, as he was known, led them inside and poured strong black tea from an iron kettle. The cabin was spare but clean, lined with books, bundles of dried herbs, and old maps rolled tightly and stacked along one wall. This land you speak of, Hawk said, unrolling a creased parchment on the table. Whitmore. That was your husband? Claire nodded. Yes, he bought the homestead 8 years ago. Did he register it with the town, or with the old agency? I'm not sure. I remember a paper, but it's gone. Hawk studied her, then turned to Rye. You trust her? With my life, Rye answered without hesitation. Something flickered behind Hawk's eyes. Approval, perhaps. Then I will help. He retrieved a battered ledger from the shelf and opened it to a page near the back. After running his finger along a list of names and deeds, he tapped twice. James Whitmore, Section 23, north of the Winding Brook. Signed under the old clerk's ledger before the agent changed hands. Claire leaned forward. So it's real? It was, but your name isn't on it. That's the danger. But I'm his wife. Hawk gave her a gentle, knowing look. That means little to men who deal in ink and coin. You need a witness, a man of standing to vouch, and you'll need to speak at the land office yourself. Claire stiffened. They won't listen to me. They will, Hawk said firmly, if you bring the right voice beside you. He turned to Rye. You've spent your life walking between two worlds. Now it's time to speak for one. Rye didn't respond at first. Then he gave a quiet nod. I'll stand with her. They stayed the night in Hawk's cabin. Eli slept curled near the fire, and Claire lay awake beneath a heavy wool blanket, staring at the beams overhead. She hadn't planned on this, on legal battles or riding into town like a soldier. She was a mother, not a fighter. But somewhere along the way, through winter, hunger, and fire, she'd remembered what she'd once been. Not helpless, not forgotten. Strong! And with Rye at her side, she was no longer standing alone. They set out for Willow Ridge before first light. Claire rode with a steady grip on the reins, her spine straight despite the nerves coiling in her stomach. Eli sat behind Hawk in silence, eyes wide, the weight of the moment clear on his young face. Rye rode beside her, quiet as ever, but his presence alone was an anchor, solid, steady, unshakable. As the sun crested the hills, the town of Willow Ridge came into view. a cluster of buildings wrapped in wood smoke and morning haze. It looked peaceful from a distance, but Claire knew better. Behind those doors were whispers, men with pens and sharp smiles, and one in particular, Elias Cartwell, the land agent, who believed her land was his for the taking. They tied the horses near the post office and walked the rest of the way. Rye carried Hawk's old satchel, inside which lay the original ledger page Hawk had protected for years, evidence James Whitmore had owned the land fair and clear. Claire's heart beat like thunder in her chest, but she kept her voice calm when they stepped into the land office. A man with a polished vest and too oily hair looked up from his desk. "Can I help?" He stopped mid-sentence, eyes narrowing when he saw Claire, then Rye. "Well," he said with a smirk, "I heard you'd stirred up some trouble. Thought you'd come begging." "I've come to defend what's mine," Claire said, her voice clear. Cartwell chuckled. "You think a widow and a—" His glance at Rye lingered too long. "Wanderer can stop what's already in motion?" Rye set the satchel down with purpose and slowly opened it. Hawk stepped forward, staff tapping against the wooden floor. "This ledger proves James Whitmore's claim, signed under the authority of the old agency, not your corrupt deals." Cartwell's smirk faltered. "That book isn't valid anymore." Rye's voice cut through the room, low and firm. "Then let's see the judge. Let's let the whole town hear who you've been stealing from. This ledger doesn't just have one name in it." Claire stepped forward. "If you think I'm afraid, you're wrong. I've buried a husband, starved through winter, fought off men with torches and empty hearts. You don't scare me." Cartwell's mouth opened, then closed. Behind them, other voices began to gather. People in line at the telegraph. A ranch hand near the window. Even Deputy Harlan stepped inside from the boardwalk, arms folded. "You heard her," the deputy said. "She's got a right to speak, and from where I stand, she's got more claim to that land than you ever will." For the first time, Cartwell looked uncertain. Hawk leaned close, eyes sharp. "You can try to take from her, but every tree remembers the truth, and so do we." By noon, Cartwell had signed an official letter recognizing Claire Whitmore as the legal heir of the homestead. Under pressure, and the eyes of a town that was no longer so blind, he folded, not because of threats, but because truth had finally spoken loud enough. That evening, Claire, Rye, Eli, and Hawk rode back toward the horizon. The prairie wind felt different now. Not empty, but full, like something had been restored. "You were brave," Rye said as they reached the ridge. Claire smiled. "You were beside me." He didn't respond, but his eyes said enough. Then, softly, she added, "You don't have to keep moving, Rye. You could stay." A beat passed, then another. "I've been searching for a place that felt like peace," he said. "I think I found it." Spring arrived quietly, not in a single day, but in hints. The way the frost lingered a little less each morning, the way the soil beneath Claire's boots finally softened. The children ran barefoot again. The chickens laid regularly, and Rye had planted a row of corn beside the eastern fence, the same place Eli had buried his first snare trap. The homestead was no longer just surviving. It was becoming something whole again. Rye stayed, not in words, not in promises, but in presence. He repaired the barn roof with Eli, taught Sarah how to track by birdsong, and let Lily braid feathers into his hair, even though he never once smiled about it. Claire caught him watching the children sometimes, a strange kind of wonder behind his quiet. At night, she'd find him outside staring at the stars like they whispered old memories only he could hear. One evening, as they shared coffee on the porch, Claire asked softly, "Do you ever miss the road?" Rye looked down at the mug in his hand. "I miss forgetting." "Forgetting what?" "That I once believed I wasn't meant to be part of something." Claire's chest tightened. "And now?" He turned to her. "Now I'm learning that being part of something might have been what I was meant for all along." News reached them weeks later. Elias Cartwell had left Willow Ridge. Quietly. Word was, someone higher up had started asking questions about falsified claims and vanished land records. Deputy Harlan paid Claire a visit just to say, "You changed more than your own story." He looked over at Rye. "That man of yours, folks are starting to talk about him like a legend." Claire smiled. "Let them, I know the truth." On the first warm night of May, they lit a fire outside and cooked over the flames. Hawk joined them. He rarely stayed in one place long, but he said, "This land still sings, and I like her tune." The stars came out brighter than they had in months. Eli and Sarah fell asleep under a wool blanket, and Lily curled beside Claire. Rye sat with his back against a tree, carving something into a piece of driftwood. Claire moved to sit beside him. "You've given us a home," she said softly. He looked at her. "No, you kept it alive long enough for me to find it." She reached out and took his hand, not asking, not waiting. And he didn't let go. In that moment, there were no ghosts left to fight, no storms on the horizon, no memories louder than the present. Just a widow who refused to break, a warrior who chose to stay, and a family rebuilt not by blood but by choice. The summer was kind. Crops rose from the earth, small but strong. The creek behind the house ran clear and sweet again. Birds nested near the window where Claire once sat staring out, unsure if morning would bring hope or more hunger. Now she sat there beside Rye, mending shirts while he whittled toys for the girls. His hands were steady, calloused, careful, as if everything he touched deserved gentleness. One afternoon, while the children played by the garden, Claire looked over and said softly, "They're healing." Rye nodded. "So are we." On the anniversary of James Whitmore's passing, Claire took the children to his grave. She knelt, placed a simple wooden carving at the headstone, a wolf, shaped by Rye's hands, and whispered thanks. Not for the pain, but for the strength that had grown in its place. "I still love him," she told Rye later that night. "I know," he said. Claire searched his face for hurt, but found none, only understanding. "I'm not here to replace anything," he added, "just to build something new, if you'll let me." Her reply was a quiet hand on his chest and a breath she hadn't let go of in years. By fall, the cabin had changed in small ways. 2 rocking chairs on the porch, new curtains in the window, a cradle for Lily's favorite doll, carved from oak. But the greatest change was inside, the peace, the laughter, the light. Rye began calling Claire's children his without even realizing it. "Eli, your snare line's crooked. Come fix it before supper." "Sarah, I saw your drawing by the barn. It's beautiful." "Lily, no braiding feathers in the goat's tail again." They called him Pa one morning out of the blue. He froze, blinked once, said nothing. But that night, when he tucked them in, his voice was softer than ever. And Claire saw the way his shoulders relaxed, as if some invisible weight had lifted. On the first snow of winter, Rye built a small shelter near the edge of the property. Not to live in, but to pray and remember. He carved symbols from his mother's people into the doorpost, then stood there in silence for a long while. Claire joined him, no words needed. She simply reached for his hand and he took it. They weren't a love story written in fireworks or grand declarations. They were a story of survival, of quiet healing, of trust rebuilt from the ashes, of a warrior who had no name left until the children gave him one, of a widow who'd buried her past until love helped her rise again. And long after the world forgot the storms they weathered, that little cabin stood, solid, humble, and full of life. A place where strangers became family, and where love didn't come loudly, but stayed.